You didn't believe anything that I said. When they came, you were not prepared. Then it all fell right on your head. And now you're lying in your bed. Oh. You've got yourself in a rabbit hole. You're trapped 'cause you did not let go. You took that bait and now...
Hey guys, it's Gary with Alice Eats the Apple. I am finding it much easier to work from the end to the beginning. So I would like to tell you about my guest that I just finished interviewing, Suzy Hansen. She is the author of the amazing book, Dual Soul Connection. And it discusses everything E.T. Well, much more than that. So first, if you remember, we had Margie Kay. She is an investigator, paranormal. She's psychic. She's phenomenal. Then we had Bill Spicer on the show, and Bill taught us how to video craft up in the sky. Now, Suzy kind of explains who we connect with and why we connect with them and what their ideas are and how it relates to consciousness, organic technologies, spirituality, paranormal activity. It all goes hand in hand. And basically, the gist of it is they're wanting us to wake up. It's time. It's time, as they told me, to take your seat at the big boy table. So I hope you really enjoy this show. Her work is incredible, and it's interesting how she came into my field. I met Bill. Bill reached out to me. He introduced me to Dr. Schild, who is a Harvard professor. Bill also introduced me to this whole concept of grays and how they interact with us, which kind of a little bit freaked me out. So I spoke with Ashley from the E-City Ranch, and she said, "Oh wait, no. I have a friend, Suzy Hansen. You would love her. She deals with the grays a lot and this hybrid." And anyway, so I picked up her book, and I couldn't put it down. And I haven't read a book in a while. Loved the book, so I reached out to her, and she agreed to come on the show. Yay us! And so anyway, I hope you enjoy the show. Please let me know what you think. Drop in your comments. Reach out to her. I think you're gonna like this one. All right, I hope you're doing well. Talk to you soon. Hey, everybody. I'm back, and I'm now in my new studio, and I'm very excited about this. So hopefully we won't have the same issues that we've had in the past. So I just want to launch in because this guest that I have, there's so much. I think we could do 5 shows and not even scratch the surface. So I want to introduce my incredible guest, Suzy Hansen. Hi.
Hi, Kerry. Thank you very much. Very nice to be able to talk to you today on this very cold New Zealand morning.
Oh, man. So you are 17 hours ahead of us.
Yes.
In the future,
yeah,
or at least us here in Houston.
Yes, we live in the future in New Zealand. We're officially the first to see the sun.
I love that. I love that. And it's cold there. Here in Houston, it's been raining, and I think today we got up to about 98 degrees.
Okay, it's about 14 or 15 here, maybe a little less.
Oh, man, that is cold. That is cold. I would love a little bit of that right now. Well, I wanted to just jump in. You wrote, I've not read... It seems that when we first wake up on our path, we read, we devour everything. We go to all the classes, we look at every single YouTube thing we can find, and then you start to integrate and you find your path, and you I don't know, I put the books down. I don't read the books anymore. I'm not really drawn to things. And then Ashley introduced me to your work, and I mean, look at this. I have the book, and it's earmarked, and I love it. I couldn't put it down. I could read it 3 more times, and it spoke to me clearly. So she is the author of the Dual Soul Connection, and this book, I don't even know where to start. I think trying to describe your experiences and where we're going, it's tough. It's tough. But I did come up with a way to try to frame this. So basically, okay, I'm just going to have to read it because I don't want to mess this up. We will frame your work in, hold on, let's see, where did I put that? Where did I put that? I have too many pieces of paper. Here we go. This is what I would like to say about this. Okay, you live this life as a dual soul or a hybrid. And your book details your experience as a human waking up to the fact that you are a dual soul or a hybrid, and what all that means to you as Susie. I mean, and that would encompass alien contact, alien abduction, but I kind of don't like that word. I mean, in this context, because that implies that it's something negative. And your experiences and all of this, and where do you want to launch in? Do you want to launch in that night in 1970?
Well, yeah, I can start with what really woke me up, because very often people experience a life circumstance. It can be a trauma, or it can be a wonderful, joyous event, or it can be a spiritual epiphany, or something that happens with your favorite dog or cat or whatever. And people have a spiritual reaction to it, or a spiritual awakening. Other people, perhaps many who've had contact all their lives, but may not necessarily understand it or know it or accept it, often have a real wake-up call, something that can appear to be at first quite traumatic, as it was for me, and then you spend many years assimilating that into your life and examining it, coming to terms with it, understanding it, and then extending on it. And that's what happened to me in 1975, when I was on a lonely country road with my flatmate in a car, late afternoon, lovely sunshine on a paddocks full of sheep in quite a remote area. We saw these lights over the hills. They clicked out and suddenly appeared next to us, and then clicked out and appeared back in their original position. And this took a few seconds before each movement of the lights, during which time we were arguing whether it was a helicopter or whether it was an agricultural aircraft flying towards us with these two bright lights. But eventually it disappeared altogether, and we thought, oh, that's great. We'd gone down to second gear, crawling along very slowly, right at the beginning of a 2.5 kilometre straight across the riverbeds. And at that point we thought, okay, we're safe, whatever it is, however unusual it was, it's gone. And we bickered a little bit about whether it was a UFO or an aircraft, because UFOs were in my reality, having seen one when I was 8 years old with my family. But my flatmate was a scientist and he didn't accept that. So there was a bit of bickering, and then we started to drive off. And as we did, this massive light came up behind us, out of nowhere, wider than the road, came over our car. Everything was illuminated with the brightest, most glaring, painful light, turning everything to bright white and silver. And the last thing I recall was the car being lifted off the road, and that feeling in your stomach that you get when an aircraft leaves the tarmac. You get that feeling in your tummy. And then I must have blacked out, as I was aware my flatmate already had, because I turned my head to look at him and he was no longer driving, and he was just leaning against the door jamb as if he was in a trance. And that was the last thing I recalled. The next thing I recalled was hearing like a really loud clap, is the only way I can describe it, as if someone clapped right next to both ears. And that sort of woke me up into this strange environment of darkness, pitch black, a feeling of flotation, and then the feeling of the car hitting the road, the headlights coming on, the motor starting up, and we're now at the far end of the straight, about to go over a one-way bridge, and it's pitch black, it's dark. And that was the most shocking and traumatic moment, probably one of the most shocking of my life, trying to work out with my flatmate what had happened. So we argued and shouted for about 20 minutes or so, trying to understand what had happened to us. And then we lapsed into silence because we couldn't agree on anything. And got back to our flat and were told by the rest of our flatmates that our tea was in the oven. It was charred, no good to eat anymore, and why were we so late? And the television news should have been on. We'd aimed to be home in time to see the news, and something else was on. And we had no answers whatsoever for our flatmates. We had no answers for ourselves, but we both were extremely thirsty, extremely dry mouth, very shaken, very light sensitive, very noise sensitive, and extremely jittery is the only way I can describe it. And we both went to our rooms and went to bed and couldn't speak to each other about it. I tried to ask him over a period of weeks what he recalled, what he thought of it, and each time his reaction was to become extremely angry and eventually leave the flat and move elsewhere, and we lost contact. But before that happened, he did concede to me that it was the most extraordinary, terrifying event for him. It shook his worldview, it shook his scientific view of everything. And because he had no answers, he just did not want to see the person who was continually asking him questions, which was me.
Well, yes. I mean, his entire world was rocked where it shut him down, but it catapulted you to the next.
It catapulted me into a state of huge curiosity. And I virtually immediately began asking around people I knew and farming families I knew, if anyone had ever seen any lights behaving that way. And it was just astounding, some of the stories that I was told by farming families in the area. One lady had been driving home back to Hastings in the early hours of the morning, got to go on nursing duty at the hospital. And about 5:30, she saw what she thought was a haystack on fire, and it turned out to be a craft with an orange glow around it landed in a paddock. So this event catapulted me headlong into not only documenting UFO sightings in New Zealand for the last 44 years, but also into my search to understand the contact that began to evolve over the years following this event, and the realization that they'd been happening since childhood.
At what point did you, because you said that you can recall waking up as a young one with beings, so at what point did you start putting the pieces together?
That was in my late 20s, early 30s when I really came to that realization, because to me those were separate memories. They were memories from childhood of seeing something unusual in my room and having these strange vivid dreams about unusual, very modern looking white rooms with strange entities and strange creatures. And as a child, of course, in New Zealand, we were not up to the mark as much as, say, the US with space and the idea of flying saucers, etc. It was very hush-hush in New Zealand. And following that sighting I had as an 8-year-old, I had this terrific raising of consciousness, is the only way I can describe it. I became, I'd always been what you might call a psychic child, but from that age onwards, it really escalated, and that was another thing I had to learn to deal with as a child. So I had these separate sets of memories about being woken at night by these golden glowing figures, silhouettes by my bed with no real features visible. And so I didn't align that at the time with this quite spectacular thing that happened when I was 20 with my car being swallowed up and lifted off the road. For me at that time, there wasn't really a link between the two, and it took quite some years before that link really started to show up, and I had to take a deep breath and swallow and realize that this had been happening all my life.
Well, and I think when I look back on things, they're just part of your story. They're part of your world. And you think everybody experiences them in their dreams, and you can very easily give explanation for them. You don't think that you're being taken on a craft as a child.
No, that was the last thing on my mind as a young child, and my mother explained it away in religious terms. So although she could see spirits the same as I could as a child, she explained these events away that I described as either being guardian angels coming to visit me, which I'd learned about at Sunday school, or they were spirits of family members who'd passed on coming to check on me and just looking in on me, some of my great aunts, etc. So that made complete sense to me in some respects. In others it didn't, because I knew that what I had seen looked different to angels and certainly didn't look like Auntie Cassie. So, what was it?
And so we actually just showed a picture of the three beings around you, and
Yep.
and that is, at what point did that come in? Right now, I'm in this place of bringing the formless into form, and there are concepts, there are ideas, there are things that I've always seen, but to bring them in is completely different. So, at what point did you bring in what these actually were? I know you were saying in your late 20s, but how did that puzzle start to actually come together?
Okay, well, I began to have more and more experiences of missing time when I was living and teaching in a very remote area. So I had the same sort of thing of bright lights coming over the house at night, not being able to wake my former husband, not being able to move apart from my head and my eyes. And having snippets of memories of being in these rooms with these unusual creatures, unusual looking entities. And these weren't just vague kind of memories. There were some very specific details dating back. I have got a lot of experiences where I remember certain technology, or I remember certain ways things were done on the craft. And at that point I was still learning to acknowledge that it was likely a craft that I was on, and that these were likely to be extraterrestrials or aliens. So there were phenomenal things that I could remember and describe at that stage to a few close people. But it wasn't until 1997, many years later, that I actually spoke at a conference and went public about some of these technologies and that I was seeing. And in those days, it sounded like sci-fi, it sounded like complete fantasy. And even to me, standing up speaking about it, sometimes it was like, what am I doing? This just doesn't we don't have stuff like this. What does it mean? And of course, in my recent speech last year at the UFO Congress in Phoenix, I brought out a lot of these technologies and how we are now producing those much lesser sophisticated versions of those technologies. So it was in my 30s that I had a particular event where I slipped out of, I was standing in the hallway with my son, and I slipped out of what experiencers call the altered state. And I suddenly could hear them telepathically, clearly talking to each other, three entities that were there. And I responded, just automatically responded telepathically. And they were a little surprised, realized that I'd slipped out of that state. And I heard one say to the other two quite clearly telepathically, she is ready to remember more, which indicated to me that there is this readiness stage that they go through. So they're transporting you in this altered state. And at some stage, they are monitoring how you're assimilating this into your life. They're monitoring how you are faring. And at some point, you begin to remember more, because that's your path. It's not the path for everybody who has these experiences, but it has been mine. And at some stage on a craft, I was showing myself writing a book. I was showing myself speaking in front of a lot of people. And at that point in my life, I was quite a shy person. Although I was a teacher, I wasn't an extrovert. And the thought of doing that was quite overwhelming, and not something that I had anticipated for myself in life. But of course, that is what has eventuated. And through no thrust on my part, it has just kept dropping in front of me, and it has happened. So that was a real turning point when I observed them in the conscious state and not the altered state.
So do you think you were able to pop out of that state, or do you think why do you think you were able to hear them at that point?
Well, the reason for that is because my other son was still in bed, my husband was away, and it occurred to me in the altered state somehow or other, and it rose from my subconscious or whatever, that one child would be left behind if I went somewhere on his own, and I was not going to have that. So that realization must have lurched me out of that state. And I had a discussion with them that I wasn't going to go. And they really wanted me to go. So, we came to a compromise, and they said one will remain. Will you be happy if one remains? And I said, yes, okay. And that really, later on, I was even horrified about that decision I'd made, because it indicated to me that I had complete trust in them, that I had complete trust to leave my house with one of my sons and leave one of them with the other. So it took me a long time, as a good mother, to
Right.
come to terms with that decision that I'd made. And it was just an instant decision, and I was not the least bit concerned for his safety, because I knew he would be fine.
Well, and they had assured you that he would stay asleep. They would make sure he stayed asleep. But if he should
Yep.
wake up, I know I actually thought about that. You told this in uh, the book.
In
It's like,
my
okay,
book, yeah.
so he wakes up and it's like, you're the babysitter. Like, how did that happen? But you also, I think that really impressed me, impressed upon me, that was when also when your fear left. That's when you began to actually
Yes.
trust them, the
Yes.
situation, and the world you now lived in.
Yes, at that point, I really began to put things together, and there was one other point where one of them was appearing in the room, and and I asked for proof that I was not imagining this. Can you do something that is proof, which is something that we as humans do? We want some proof.
Right.
And there was a terrific crash in the hallway, and my former husband and I rushed out, and saw that a very large, heavy, oak-framed, old antique mirror had fallen off the wall. And we thought, oh, thank goodness, it's okay. It's the cord's broken or something. It's not something supernatural. It's okay. But when we looked down at it, we saw that the cord wasn't a cord; it was a wire, and the wire was intact. Therefore, something had lifted it off its hook and put it down on the floor in a manner that made a noise but didn't break it.
So did you not see them, or were they just there? I mean,
Yeah, they were showing themselves to me in another state, is the best way I can put it. A lot of experiencers talk about being able to see things that other people can't see, and so he was quite visible to me. He was not visible to my former husband, but this frightened me also, because I'm only human after all. I'm here to live a life as a human, even though there are some things I'm doing which might be out of the realm of many people. Um, I telepathically, or energetically, if you want to put it that way, did something with my mind, is the only way I can state it, that sent him backwards through the wall. So he went through the wall, as many experiencers and abductees talk about, how they can come through walls and solid objects, and they take us through them as well. And as he left, as he went, he was sending to me energetically and telepathically the most immense feelings of love and regret and sadness and sorrow, that I had taken a step, that he wasn't going to harm me, that he knew me and I knew him. And at that moment, it was like these massive doors open in my mind, and suddenly everything fell into the right slot. And I realized I did know him, and I'd known him since I was a child, and I'd loved him since I was a child. And so this whole wave swept over me, that I'd done this, but I felt sure that wasn't going to be the end of the communication, and it wasn't. But this also was a big, big turning point. And from that point on, nothing and nobody could ever turn me away from this topic and from my lifelong search for more answers and more understanding.
it's so funny because you don't even know what the questions really are. I mean, that is how in the woods we are at times. I do
That's
the,
right.
I do the same thing. I want proof, and I think, oh my gosh, I was so embarrassed. I sent you, I just started writing and I couldn't stop. And I sent you this long email with all these photos. But I asked the same thing. I said, I want proof, because we started
Yes.
videoing these craft, that I'm not nuts. I'm not crazy. And the next morning I woke up with these white marks on my head. And I mean, it's just, and you still say, well, maybe that's, candida, or maybe it's anyway.
Yeah,
so
that's human nature, and the fact that we do that, in my opinion, is a good sign that we're sane people, Kerry.
I love that.
because we're examining it with a critical mind, and that is what is needed. And I think my feet are quite firmly on the ground in this subject, and I very carefully examine everything, and that is in part because my nature, the analytical aspect that the ETs have taught me since childhood, but it's also the fact that I'm a sighting investigator, and I have to look at things very clinically and critically, and look for alternatives and logical answers first, and eliminate those, and so that's part of my process.
Oh, and I feel that from you, and I'm finding myself, I'm more attracted, and I'm going more down the road of Dr. Schild and yourself and Bill Spicer, and just more of this analytical. It needs to make sense, not just that you want it to be so and you want to be different and special, and that's not
Yes.
it.
And I think that there's so many things happening in the UFO field, and particularly in the contact field. There's a lot of what I no longer call some contact researchers. I call them theorists, contact theorists. And I think that people in many ways have been led to believe very mistaken ways of thinking. And a lot of the things that are being put out there as gospel, if you actually sit down and talk to experiencers, they don't necessarily agree with a lot of the stuff that these contact theorists who have never had contact are putting out there. And I think we have to be very, very wary of that. I'm seeing more and more of it as people want to retain their place on the rung of the ladder of success. And notoriety. I think that there's a real danger occurring in the field, and I've been quite outspoken on this, that we need to listen to what the experiencers are saying, but at the same time, we need to examine what they are saying too. And I don't resent people examining my material at all. I welcome questions. I welcome comments. And usually when I speak, the most enjoyable part of the evening for me is actually the question time.
Really, because you get to go there, and I'm sure to places that you didn't
Yeah, I like
expect.
being challenged, because I think it really makes us think, and makes us think critically and carefully, and that's what's really important in this subject at this time.
Well, we're walking with a foot in both worlds. I definitely believe
Yes,
that.
yeah.
Well, okay, so I have to get it out of the way. So the beings that come to you are grace. And I know
Yes.
that when Bill said that he thought that my mark was a gray, it was like, wait, no, that's no. And that's when I reached out to Ashley and said, you might want to check out your work. And so that, and I did. And there's this misconception out there that all grays, all grays are the same, a hive mind. I know Bashar, I believe, says his idea is that it's us in the future, and that those who have gone AI route, no feeling, no emotion. But that is not what you report at all.
No. I have found them to have quite incredible emotions, overwhelming emotions. But unlike us, they are able to be quite analytical about the emotions, and they are able to retain something and put a lid on it in order to perform a task. We find that difficult. We're quite erratic with our emotions, and so we are operating often on our emotions, whereas they're able to express emotion at the right time or over a particular incident or issue, but they are able to retain that very analytical, clinical way of thinking in order to problem solve or whatever. And I think in some of the early contacts that happened going back into the 70s in particular, it was all new to humans, and we were not. We were coming to a point where it was just terrifying, because it was something that humanity hadn't really dealt with openly before. This whole raft of people coming forward talking about these experiences. And I think that some people, not all, but some people may have cut themselves off from the telepathy and from that energy that's being expressed to you through their emanation. And once you do that, you're looking at a very clinical face in front of you, a white face, what appears to be an expressionless face, because they don't have facial expressions like us. And I can imagine that for many people, they are going to flip straight into absolute terror
I see what you're
and
saying.
not get the message and not get the feeling. But on the other hand, I am by no way negating those people who have had traumatic experiences. And there's plenty of people who talk about that in depth. And certainly their stories are traumatic and very sad. And I acknowledge that that exists also. But are we talking about all the one species? No. There are a variety of species of greys from what I have seen and understand. And certainly on craft, I've seen lots of mixed species of a variety of other ET species. So just as we have people in humanity who do not behave in the most desirable way, there will also be other species that do the same. So this is a very difficult, sticky point still in the contact field about the positive and negative, but my experiences have only been positive. The way some of them have presented themselves to me, like the situation I described of my car being taken up. But I now know what happened during that event. And during that terrifying event, I was taken on board a craft where I was given healing and implants to combat the damage that had been done 3 months earlier in a horrific car accident that I had, where I fractured vertebra and ended up in a very bad state. And I was trying to do my first year of teaching with constant chronic severe pain and violent headaches. And I was taken on board the craft early in that year, 3 months later, for quite a thorough repair job. And my health turned around at that point and started to improve. But of course, at that time, I did not know that that's what had happened on the craft. And but I do have recollection of one of the greys saying to me, "We're sorry, but you are only going to remember certain aspects of this event." And I did. I only remembered the missing time bit and the craft coming over the car and the fear afterwards of discovering that it was dark and it should have been light. So there's a process going on with experiencers, I believe, where there's a state of readiness, and they talk to us about this. They've talked in lecture situations on craft and in underground undersea bases about this human readiness. And this is very much closely linked to disclosure and the need for it to happen slowly and carefully. And that's been happening for a long time. But also the waking up of people. I give speeches called Waking the Sleepers. And there are a lot of people who've had contact who are still asleep, don't know they've had contact. And there will come a time when something will trigger them and that realization will come to the fore. And they will need people like myself and others who are old hands at it, if I can put it that way, to ease them into this situation. Many of them will just come into it quite easily, but there'll be others who won't. And this is all timed to the timeline of what is happening on the planet with the earth changes, climate change, etc., and the revolution of our consciousness and all of the obstacles and problems, religious problems, cultural problems, etc., technical problems, technology problems that are going to go with that, institutional problems to do with what's going to happen to our education systems and our health systems when all of this stuff starts to be revealed. So there's a massive amount of work to be done, and people are just being woken up as little cogs in a wheel in a very slow but sure process.
Well, I wanted to actually ask you about that because there was one incident Well, backing up a bit, I'm not clear on this. So you are dual. It's hybrid. Am I right about that?
Well, not entirely. When we're talking about the dual soul, we're talking about duality at a soul level. But having said that, I have been told right from childhood that there has been interventions pre-birth for me. So therefore, it would appear that some alteration genetically has been made to me and to others like me in order to become the container for that soul. Because I know the process that I went through on board a craft when the soul of my son entered the baby's body inside me. And I know what that felt like, and I know the massive surge of energy that I felt. And so I was told that if they hadn't gone through this particular process, when the soul merged into the body, it would have shocked my body terribly and it wouldn't have been good for me. So they went through a process of slowing down my metabolism before this procedure took place. So yes, there's the dual soul is to do with the soul status. The actual genetics of the physical body is a separate thing altogether.
Well, do you want to hear how I like in my head how this made sense? You're like, yeah, go for it. So it is. I was told at some point by my team that there are certain people, a lot of us, that agreed to come in and to help raise consciousness. But in order to do so, we had to take the form, or there was a form, a human, and that you're part of the wheel, and you have to agree to the laws that govern this realm, this earth, but when you remember, all bets are off, and then you're no longer bound by that. So that's when you can start seeing things and doing things like, anyway, I won't go there, but so that's what I envisioned is that you perhaps are actually more gray than not, but you have to take on human form, or human, as you put it, the robe, in order to live here.
Well, it's really putting on the robe of the body to encapsulate the soul. And we are all like that. That's what we all do. But the robe or the body has been prepared in such a way that it can accommodate that particular soul. Because I was told in early childhood, I was about 8, when I was given a lot of information about this. And the soul has been enhanced, and I will be writing about this in my second book. It's been enhanced in such a way that it can tap into this grey part that has been blended with the soul. So if I can explain it this way, we're all a universal soul, and at some stage the universe says to us, it gives us an invitation to take on a new life. So we're floating up there in what Dr. Schild calls the field of consciousness. We're a little spark up there, and suddenly we get, as I describe in my book, an electric tingle that says, hey, wake up. There's another life here or a few lives you can choose from if you like. And we're presented with some choices. I was presented with 2 choices, and I chose this life rather than being a highly intelligent sponge-like form on a newly developing planet. Now that's interesting in itself, because it shows that the amount of commitment and soul intelligence required to perform that duty or task on a newly developing planet is equivalent to me living this life as a human. It makes you take a new look at moss in your garden.
Exactly.
Anyway,
That rock.
So we're given a choice, and we get the opportunity to look into those lives. So in consciousness, we're able to see futuristic aspects of that life, what it might entail, and it assists us to make a choice. So we make a choice, and then we go before what I call a UGB, or the universal governing body of this planet that oversees the incarnation of souls. And And from there, it's not so much free will, because they have a look at what you've brought with you. So when you appear before them, you've taken, say this is your spark, you've taken this bit and that bit, and you've decided that those are the pieces that are going to be most useful in this life. So in this life as Susie Hansen, I took pieces of the soul source, my soul source, that I thought would be most suited to this life. And Dr. Schild and I have talked about this at length. That means, of course, that somewhere up there in the field of consciousness, I still have some bits of spark sitting up there, part of my soul consciousness that may now be employed in a life somewhere else. And now we're talking about this parallel life thing, where we can become aware of some other life that we're leading in another form at the same time. And I'm discovering all this just like everyone else. This is all a path of discoveries. But in my understanding at this point in time, that means that I've brought part of me here, and part of my soul essence is still somewhere else, or perhaps still sleeping in the field of consciousness, waiting to be woken up. And so when you get to this point where you've got this, what you think is going to be okay for the life as Susie Hansen, and you're floating as a spark of light in front of the UGB, the Universal Governing Body, they then had a consensus decision with you and other souls that you would incarnate with, who would play a role in your life, and all of them, and there's a consensus discussion. So it's not you saying with your free will, hey, I'm going to lead this life now, I'm off. It's not like that. It's a consensus, because if you're going in to do a particular task at this point in time, they want to make sure, hedge their bets and make sure that you've got the best stuff to take with you to do that. And I think that's the case with a lot of people who've had contact experiences. They have some quite specific tasks that are not necessarily personal soul tasks for ourselves, for our own soul's growth. It's more the bigger picture of service to humanity and universal service.
So how does that relate to the idea and the concept of a higher self or oversoul? Or does it?
Well, those are terminologies that a lot of people use. I don't personally really relate to them that well. I have the dual soul concept and my understanding of that. And I've belonged to spiritual groups and meditation groups for decades, and I hear about the higher self, etc. Is this just a part of our soul being that is speaking, or is it something else that's separate to our awareness as Suzy Hansen or Kerry? I don't know. But those aren't words that really have don't really resonate with me strongly.
I don't know. I mean, it is. I mean, I guess we don't know a lot of this, but they are forms, and I think it's just another box and another terminology. But I know that it really struck me, and the visual of this struck me when you were saying that you were called and you had this important thing that you needed to that they wanted to discuss with you. So you were called, I think, below ground, maybe, or maybe it was on a large craft, and you left your human robe, your human self, kind of, and I imagine it just kind of standing there, and you popped out, and you were gray. You took on that, and you knew you're the one that called it, and you're the one that said, I need some help here, and you were out of balance between the two psyches.
That's right. So this balancing in the dual soul aspect, which is your ability to tap into the grey consciousness and lead a life as a human, Susie Hansen as well, and it had got out of balance in that I'd become too entrenched in the Susie Hansen side of things, and I was not allowing that guidance to come through from the other part of the dual soul, the grey identity. And so the grey identity was aware of this, but Susie Hansen wasn't. And so that's why the meeting was called and arranged. And when I turned up there, then the realization struck me that I was the one who'd called the meeting and that this needed to be discussed and fixed. So I have walked out of my body on a craft, left the human one standing, and walked away as a grey to perform, do healing, work with healing groups on the craft and do other tasks. But by the same token, the grey entity can be called out when in your sleep state, and I describe as a 12-year-old wondering, hearing this voice, telepathic, calling me, and I didn't know whether it was me or the grey part of me, and there was this moment of indecision which one would split off and float up there. So yeah, it's quite a complex concept, and I've only released so much of it in my first book, because I think if I'd written everything that I have an understanding of at this point, it would be too much. And so I'll further that in the next book.
Well, I know it's you go. No, you go. No, I think no, they're calling you. He's like going back and forth like these two thoughts. Well, so how many? So is this a program that's running right now? And are there more? And like out of the the 8 billion that we have here, are there a lot of people like yourself, or is everyone that's here dual?
Well, I describe this in my book in a chapter called The Three Waves. And I first spoke publicly about the three waves in 2007, just very briefly in a speech. And what is happening is within this, there are multiple multi-layered programs being run by the ETs, the greys and other species, in association with our universal governing body that oversees the incarnation of souls. And it was quite clear to them, to that group, but also to other ET groups that have been visiting our planet for a very long time, that we are spiritually retrograde. We're going backwards in the way that we treat each other and harm each other, and our attitudes towards our planet and our environment and our companion creatures. And so the call went out for volunteers to come in, and a program, multiple programs were formulated by various ET groups that are working together. And just as a little aside at this point, I'm quite interested often to hear some experiencers or abductees say, oh, this group of ETs are bad and that one's bad and this one's good. You're having contact with bad ones. I'm having contact with good ones. These are very human characteristics of one-upmanship. And it's really not like that at all with these programs, because some of those ETs that some experiencers think are bad are actually all working together on this. It's just that the greys were selected as the front people, if you want to put it that way, who interface the most with us, because their technology and the way they go about certain things was suited to that task. But I've also seen mantis beings and other mixed species and other forms of greys on craft, a whole variety of species that are doing different things in back rooms, working in science, working in what we would see as medical or healing areas. So there's a whole conglomeration of them working to a plan to assist our planet. So it's quite disheartening to see what we do to our planet on a daily basis when these programs have been formulated to try to assist us. And we're still only in the early stages of those programs. They will go on for decades, right through whatever may lie ahead of us. Those programs and the people working within them will keep working on the planet, and until we start to see things improve. But we have done the damage, and we also have to clean the damage up. They can only promote their ideas, promote their plans, and have us work alongside them.
So all of that is overseen by the UGB?
Yes, and by the ET groups that are involved. So once again, we have a consensus. We don't have someone who's necessarily in charge. We have a group discussion consensus on everything. And quite often I will see, now, I'm not saying that humans are not highly intelligent and capable of amazing inventions, because obviously throughout history there have been brilliant people, and there still are people who are quite outside the norm and are spectacularly intelligent and inventive. And we see a lot of this happening in science and medicine and technology. But more so recently, as someone who's seen a lot of ET technology and was talking about it decades ago, I'm seeing the baby efforts by us coming into fruition. So I don't, we would have to be following very closely a similar path of development in physics, etc., to these ETs for us to be inventing that on our own. And what I think is happening is that we have been supplied by this technology for a very long time, or aspects of it.
Mm-hmm.
So what's happening is now we are developing some quite smart technology, but we are moving towards what the ETs have, and that is the consciousness aspect inserted into that technology. Some people call that AI, some people call it consciousness assisted technology. But that's the aspect that's missing from our technology at the moment. And they are certainly not going to help us move too far, too fast in that area until this spirituality level comes up. Because if we are become armed with very extremely potent technology that could be used for good or for evil, and we have not raised our consciousness and our spirituality levels to a point where we can use that technology wisely, because we've proven in the past that we can't use technology wisely on every occasion. Thinking of the atomic bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, unless we can raise that consciousness and spirituality, they're not going to arm us with the kind of technology that they have got, that I have seen and used. And I believe that within these programs, so going back to these programs, they have been familiarizing millions of people worldwide for decades with what I call bridging technology. So it's somewhere between what they have and what we're capable of understanding and using. And I know this because I write in my book, I've got 2 chapters called The Test Part 1 and The Test Part 2, where I had conscious memory, extremely detailed memory of an experience on craft where I had to perform a task with 15 other people in a room to solve a problem. And it was not, the success was not going to be measured on whether or not I managed to solve the problem. The success of the test was in how I utilized my understanding of their technology and the consciousness aspect of it to solve the problem. So I think all along they've been introducing experiencers and abductees to technology, seeing how we handle it, seeing if we can raise our consciousness sufficiently to be able to use it as they do. And then they'll drip feed a little bit to our scientists. And and I have seen this being done where memories and information are implanted into their minds in meetings on craft. They have no memory that they've ever been taken on a craft and provided with this information. And then out it comes in our science. And I think this is how they are leading us to these understandings.
Well, that's what they told me too. Is that they seed it in certain. They
Yeah.
don't just give one person that idea. They give it because it takes a
Yeah.
lot of different factors to bring things to the forefront.
Exactly.
Well, it is, and I'd love to talk about this. I think you you discussed light and how, and you also, to me, all of these go together. And you discussed how you could walk into a room and it looked like it should be small, but then it was really large, and that they could make the walls dissolve. It felt to me like you were discussing the, like, kind of the holographic world that we live in, and how they could manipulate that, and they used light and consciousness to create anything. And I was curious. I mean, I think we could probably talk about that for a long time. But how
Yeah.
did they experience our world? Our very, I mean, it's not concrete, but how do they experience our world?
Well, they've never really commented to me about our world, apart from the fact that, they very nicely indicate that it's archaic compared to theirs. But they're very patient. They describe us as being very fickle in everything. They are much more analytical. So our space. They have technology which we, as even as experiencers, like I'm 64, I've been doing this for 64 years. And there's still technology that they have that we can't use because it's tuned to their consciousness there and other aspects. Now, here's an interesting thing. Many years ago, I was exposed to an augmented reality experience on a craft. And I was able to describe aspects of that. And I was told by the ET at the time that I couldn't use this virtual reality chair, what he called, what I called a virtual reality chair, um, when I was writing my book, because I didn't know how else to describe it. Um, he said it couldn't work because it was tied, the technology was tied to his optic nerves and to aspects of the makeup of his eye. And I desperately wanted to be able to experience this chair that he was using and all that it created, but I couldn't because it wouldn't respond to my eyes and my eyesight. Excuse me. Now, in New Zealand, we have a very famous workshop called Weta Workshop, which produces all kinds of special effects for the Lord of the Rings movies, the Hobbit movie, etc. It's very well known. I've won a lot of awards in the States. And recently, a young man at Weta Workshop has come up with new augmented reality technology that, interestingly, responds to the optic nerves of the person using it. So I really pricked up my ears, and I hope to include that in one of my next technology speeches, along with a lot of other stuff I've discovered since I spoke last year at the Congress. I've had a number of physicists and scientists and medical people approach me, giving me their material, even their PowerPoints and images and information. So there's some extraordinary things happening here where things that I saw decades ago are now being corroborated and validated by our own science that these things are possible, and we're now beginning to do it ourselves.
I mean, just to see that must do something to you. I mean, that must just, I don't know, I just feel
Well, I
good.
remember going into one room, which, as you said, they said they were going to expand it for a particular reason, and there were 7 of us humans in the room and quite a number of ETs. And before our eyes, the walls just moved away from us, and the whole space became very not eerie, but otherworldly, it would be the word, and white until you could no longer see the walls. And if I hadn't known that my feet were on the floor and I could feel that soft floor under my feet, I would have thought that I was floating in a vast white space. And then the color and the sound and all of their virtual reality sensations and the way that they disintegrated their bodies and incorporated that in that virtual reality was mind-blowing. And when Dr. Schild read my manuscript, asked for chapters of my manuscript, he said, "Send me a couple of chapters that you think might stretch me too far, that you are worried about." And that was one of the ones I sent to him. And thinking, well, he's going to say this woman's crazy, this couldn't possibly happen. And he came back and said, in terms of physics, these are the 2 chapters that I can understand and align with the most. So that was very validating for me to have a cosmologist and astrophysicist make a statement like that.
And by the way, where does he work? Harvard. I mean,
Harvard.
he's just a
Yeah.
brilliant man, and he's bringing the 2 worlds together, which I love him and others. I there was one other really big thing. How if people are starting to remember things, and I know our time is getting short, but if people are starting to remember things and they're getting snippets here and there, what do you suggest they do if they want to open up more to it?
I suggest they talk to another experiencer. It's all very well to speak to researchers, but when you're talking about the things that I'm talking about, they won't relate to that because they haven't experienced it. It's always safer to talk to other experiencers, which is why experiencer groups run often by experiencers are going to be your best bet. Be very careful about who you tell around you and your family and friends, because that can mean the end of relationships. Um, and and just be very careful that you walk before you run, because some people want to go, they become like the newly converted and they want to go public very quickly. This too can be extremely damaging. And as I have experienced myself with my health having been affected by, I've been hit by things, I've had my house broken into, I've been watched, the neighbours have seen me being watched, so it's not my imagination. There are the dangerous sides to coming out as an experiencer, especially if you go public and you speak at conferences. But someone who is just becoming aware of these things, by all means read some books, but remember that not everything out there on YouTube is gospel. And the best thing is to seek out an experiencer group where they meet and discuss things. And I think that's where you'll get the most support.
Well, how would you, you've been hit by things?
Yes, I was sprayed with something when I was speaking at a conference last year, and within 48 hours I was in hospital and nearly died, and I had bacterial skin infection, bacterial blood infection, and bacterial lung infection all at once. And I was intimidated by two guys late at night in a corridor on my own. So there are these things that happen, and I have written in my book, there's a whole chapter on that kind of thing. It is a reality. There are groups out there that don't want you to talk about these things and don't want the public to know what's really going on. So there is always danger in these areas.
Man, it makes me a little bit worried. I mean, no, it is. Well, how do you, so, and I know that you had an experience where where someone came to you and said, "We've got your back. You're okay. Well, you're protected," but it doesn't sound like you're completely protected.
Well, there is a limit to what they can do, of course, without exposing themselves. But I was protected in the sense that on the night that I nearly died in hospital, there just happened to be a world-renowned specialist in infectious diseases who just happened to be in Tauranga, little old city of Tauranga in tiny little New Zealand at the bottom of the world. And the medical staff knew where she was, and they called her and asked her to come in. And she came in, took one look at me, changed the antibiotics, gave a whole lot of orders, and left. And after that, I began to recover.
Wow.
So these uncanny interventions that are most unlikely that have occurred. So I've had 6 near-death experiences in my life where I've nearly died, and some extraordinary intervention has happened that has pulled me out of it.
Oh, well, I wish you all the protection and the safety.
Thank you.
Has it been a while? I mean, are those things starting to calm down, you think?
No, because the most recent one happened last year in February. So no, they're not calming down. But I do believe there's more openness, but there is still some stubborn negative group on our planet here that just really wants to throw a spanner in the works on this. And I know other experiencers, I won't name them, but I'm sure you may know some well-known speakers who've experienced the same as me.
Mm-hmm.
It seems that in particular women have been targeted, but not always.
Hmm. That's interesting. Well, that's hopefully that is going by the wayside. I mean, it just, I think the more of us that wake up and the more of us that talk about it, I think there's safety in numbers. But I applaud you for having the courage and the gumption to continue speaking.
Thank you.
I don't think you have a choice. I mean, I really, I mean,
No.
of course you do, but I don't think you feel like you have a choice.
No, every time I have tried to take a break or just thought to myself, I feel like I'm banging my head against a brick wall. I don't think I'll do this anymore. It just doesn't happen. You know, something else drops in front of me, and I have a very, very powerful commitment to this work, and I can't give it up.
Now, do you recall now when you're on the ship where before you didn't always bring all of the information back with you? Do you pretty much have total recall?
I do have very extensive recall, and I tend to recall obviously what I need to recall for whatever might be coming up next in my life, etc. But there are, I think, over the decades, the manner in which people like myself and other experiencers are contacted has changed. And sometimes it's not necessarily the old way of them coming into your room and escorting you, floating you onto a craft, and the sky's full of craft that night with people being transported. It's not like that anymore. As experiencers have raised their consciousness and become more familiar with the telepathy and the kinds of communications that take place, and our consciousness has broadened, particularly when you're on the craft. In the same way that rooms can expand, your consciousness expands, so you're able to relate to them better. And so I think this is reflected in the way that we are contacted now. It's much more a telepathic thing. It's much more the soul or leaving the body, the spirit leaving the body, and being informed in other ways, not necessarily always the full physical body that goes.
That you have to go. Well, okay, so when does the next book come out? Do you have a drop date?
Well, it's taken me some time to recover from that spray that sprayed me a year ago. I have got my book mapped out and have made notes and have started the first chapter. It's all planned out, so it's just a matter now of the time to put it together. So
Well,
I'm not going to put a time limit on it because something always happens.
that's exactly right. Well, your book is getting great reviews on Amazon.
Thank
The
you.
Dual Soul Connection. It is wonderful. I mean, it's even if you're just interested, curious, it is, and I think it's so charged too that I think it's your book wakes people up. It's seeded somehow with this energy that people say, "Oh, I remember that. I remember that." And anyway, so thank you for writing that. Thank you for coming on. You'll have to come back and play with us again because that was just the surface. I have 1,000 other questions and questions and questions. So thank you, Susie.
Thank you, Kerry. And at some stage too, you might like to talk to me about the sighting side of New Zealand, because that also involves contact and seeing entities, etc. And there's a big crossover that goes on there, and sightings are much maligned, but there's actually a lot happening in that arena as well.
Yes, I would love to. And that, do you guys get a lot of activity there?
We do. We don't know why. Maybe it's because we're so remote that makes it an ideal place to come in and maybe have a base or something. I don't know.
Well, it's clean too. I think it's a lot cleaner than the U.S. But well, thank you again, and I can't wait to talk with you again. And God bless you. I mean, this is just fun stuff and life altering.
Thank you, Kerry.
Information. Well, thank you.
Thank you, and congratulations for being the person who gives people like me an opportunity to speak. Thank you very much.
Well, you have to agree to come on, so thank you for that. And we're just all full of thanks. And I'm going to post all of your information and how people can reach out, your website, and your list of things you will be speaking at and doing, and so that people can get in touch with you if
Okay. Thank you,
they need to.
Kerry.
Thank you. Take care.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.